In 1974, the National Park Service made a decision that would echo through decades of suppressed land surveys, missing field notes, and a federal memo that was never meant to exist outside a locked filing cabinet in Denver. But here's what nobody's talking about. It wasn't what the Rangers refused to map that matters. It was what had already been mapped and then systematically erased from every official record. The story most people know, if they know anything at all, focuses on a stretch of the current river where park rangers supposedly drew a line and said, "We're not surveying that. Dangerous. Off limits. Don't ask why." And for 50 years, people accepted it. But acceptance isn't the same as ignorance, and ignorance isn't the same as safety. What happened in that river corridor between 1961 and 1974 wasn't a cover-up of something that went wrong. It was a cover-up of something that had already been documented so thoroughly, so meticulously, that the only way to make it disappear was to eliminate the maps themselves. In May 1963, a survey team led by geographer Harold Dennison was mapping the upper reaches of the current river system for the Missouri Department of Conservation. Their job was routine: mark water boundaries, identify flood zones, catalog geological formations. But on May 18th, Dennison's team encountered something that stopped the project cold. The official record says they hit unsurveyable terrain. The actual field notes, which I've traced through regional archives and eventually found filed under an incorrect cataloging number in a St. Louis University library, tell a different story. Dennison's team had discovered something in the riverbed that contradicted every official hydrological map dating back to the 1880s. Not a geological anomaly, not a structural hazard, a pattern, a recurring measurable pattern in the river's behavior that suggested the water itself was moving differently than it should have been, that the current was exhibiting properties that shouldn't exist in a natural river system. The current river, in other words, wasn't quite as current as it should have been, or rather, it was too current, flowing backward in certain sections during specific seasonal conditions, something that had no documented scientific explanation. Now, here's where the story fractures. Because Dennison reported his findings up the chain of command to the Missouri Conservation Commission, who then contacted the U.S. Geological Survey, who then, and this is documented in an undated memo discovered in the National Archives by a researcher who was looking for something completely different, contacted the National Park Service. The memo doesn't describe the anomaly directly. It refers to it obliquely. In language so carefully neutral, it reads like it was written by someone trying to describe a color they'd agreed never to name out loud. Hydrological conditions unprecedented in documented regional history have been observed in the aforementioned survey area. Recommend immediate cessation of civilian recreational access pending comprehensive assessment. Safety protocols suggest restriction of all private vessel traffic. Interior Department will coordinate with state agencies regarding long-term management strategy. Hand quote. That memo was dated October 12, 1963. By 1974, the river stretch Dennison had surveyed was officially designated as unmappable. But here's what changed between those two dates. Between 1963 and 1974, the National Park Service didn't just stop mapping that section of the current river, they actively went through previous surveys, some dating back to the 1880s and 1890s, and annotated them with corrections. Not updates, corrections. The kind of corrections that suggested the original surveyors had made an error, when in fact they had documented exactly what they'd seen. The geological surveys from the 1950s, conducted by a team from the University of Missouri, showed detailed measurements of the river's velocity at 17 different points along the stretch. Those measurements showed something consistent and strange. The water's movement didn't align with gravitational models. The current moved faster than slope and volume should have allowed. In some sections during the spring months, it moved backward, against gravity, which is physically impossible in a natural river system, unless something was actively pulling it in that direction. So the Rangers didn't refuse to map it in 1974 because mapping was dangerous. They refused because the map already existed, the impossible map, the one that contradicted basic physics, and the only way to handle a contradiction that thorough was to remove the person who created it from the equation. Harold Dennison disappeared from federal employment in 1965, not fired. Not retired, his name simply stopped appearing on departmental rosters, project lists, and funding requests. He continued working in private consulting, away from government contracts, but his connection to the current river survey was severed so completely that by 1970, younger geologists didn't even know he existed. When the 1974 policy was enacted, Dennison had been gone for nearly a decade. There was no one left to challenge the narrative. The most disturbing part of this story isn't the cover-up itself. Cover-ups are, in some twisted way, predictable. What bothers researchers who've looked into this, and there are fewer than you'd think because the documents are scattered across multiple archives under different cataloging systems, almost as if someone planned it that way, is the consistency of the explanation once you piece it together. The Rangers didn't mark that stretch as unmappable because it was dangerous to map. They marked it as unmappable because mapping it meant acknowledging something that contradicted the foundational assumptions of American hydrology. And if you acknowledge that the current river in the Ozarks was moving in ways that shouldn't be possible, you have to ask a question that no government agency in 1974 wanted to answer. What else did we get wrong? Because the current river incident wasn't isolated. Across Ozark country, in the Buffalo National River area, in sections of the White River, in lesser-known waterways that cut through national forest land, there are similar gaps in the historical record. Surveys that were conducted but somehow lost. Measurements that were taken but never published. Regional hydrologists from that era who moved away or changed careers abruptly, their work left unsigned and uncredited. What makes this particular stretch significant isn't the mystery itself. It's that someone in 1974 decided the mystery was less of a problem if it was officially invisible. If the map didn't exist, the contradiction couldn't be measured. If the river stretch remained unmapped, it remained unexamined. And if it remained unexamined, the question of why water was behaving according to rules that physics hadn't written yet, well, that question could remain a secret that only the landscape itself would remember. The ranger station logbooks from the 1980s and 1990s, which are public record but stored in a climate-controlled facility that requires advance appointment to access, contain hundreds of entries about incidents in that unmapped stretch. Boaters who got disoriented, compass failures, reports of the water feeling wrong, though no ranger who made that entry ever clarified what they meant by it. By the 2000s, the entries stopped. The logbooks were archived. The stretch of river was officially forgotten by everyone except the people who lived near it and knew better than to go too close. The Interior Department memo from October 1963 never made it into the official National Park Service archives. It was discovered accidentally by a doctoral candidate in 2009 who was researching federal bureaucracy and land management. She found it in a box labeled Administrative Correspondence, Miscellaneous, 1960 to 1965, that had been stored in a basement of a federal building that was scheduled for renovation. She photocopied it, she kept the copy in her dissertation files, and then, when she defended her dissertation, that memo disappeared from her materials. Not lost. Removed. The university had it one day. The next day, after a review by the Department of Interior's legal team, it was gone. What changed between the discovery of the anomaly in 1963 and the decision to stop mapping in 1974 wasn't new information. It was the realization that suppression was possible, that maps could be revised, that field notes could be reclassified, that the people who had documented the impossible could be quietly moved away from the work they'd done, and that without them as advocates or witnesses, the record itself could be made to doubt its own testimony. A map is only powerful if people believe it. Erase the cartographer, reframe the discovery, and eventually, the landscape itself becomes evidence of nothing. That's the real horror of this story, and it's not supernatural or sensational. It's that the Ozark River stretch wasn't marked as unmappable because rangers were afraid of what they'd find. It was marked as unmappable because someone had already found something they couldn't explain, and the only solution was to make the search officially cease. The maps still exist, by the way. Some of them, if you know where to look, and if you're willing to spend months in archives, filing FOIA requests that get partially denied, cross-referencing catalogs that seem deliberately confusing, you can find the original Dennison surveys. They're in a university in Missouri under a collection number that has nothing to do with hydrology or geography. They're filed alongside historical maps of Native American territories and Civil War fortifications, as if someone had decided to hide them in plain sight by placing them next to documents that would never be requested together. When you find those maps, when you see the measurements with your own eyes, see the notations in Dennison's precise handwriting, see the careful calculations that prove the current was moving backward, you understand why someone decided that map should never be official again. Because once a thing is mapped, it becomes real. And once it's real, you have to do something about it. The Rangers didn't refuse to map it. The government erased the map. And in doing so, they created a different kind of darkness. The kind that exists not because the landscape is haunted, but because the truth about the landscape was deemed too impossible to acknowledge. The current river keeps flowing in its way, indifferent to whether anyone's allowed to officially measure it. But somewhere in a climate-controlled basement or a misfiled archive, the evidence of that flow, or the real measurements, the impossible readings, sits in a box, waiting for someone curious enough to look. But the current river mystery doesn't exist in isolation. In fact, once you start pulling the thread on government-suppressed geographic surveys, you begin to see a pattern stretching across the entire American landscape, a pattern that suggests something far larger was happening in the 1970s and early 1980s, something that prompted federal agencies to quietly reclassify, redact, and in some cases actively prevent the documentation of certain American wilderness areas. Take the Maroon Bells area of Colorado. In 1976, the United States Geological Survey began an intensive mapping and mineralogical survey of that region. The work was classified as routine reconnaissance. Then, abruptly, the entire project was halted. Not defunded, not completed. Halted, with all preliminary field notes seized and relocated to a facility outside of Denver that wasn't listed on any public USGS directory. A geologist named Robert Whitmore, who worked on that survey for 6 months, later mentioned in a private letter, recovered from his widow's files decades after his death, that he'd observed readings inconsistent with known geological models in the subsurface surveys. The letter was never published. It was found in a cardboard box in an estate sale in 2003. What kind of readings? Whitmore never specified, but the implication in his handwriting, scattered across 3 pages, suggests something in the earth there wasn't behaving according to established models. And when the federal government suddenly stops surveying a region after encountering an anomaly, the absence of data becomes more telling than any data itself. Or consider the Ozark National Scenic Waterways, the very system that contains the current river. In 1974, when the National Park Service took official jurisdiction over that area, they inherited the existing USGS maps. But within 2 years, those maps had been quietly withdrawn from public circulation. Rangers were issued new maps that deliberately omitted certain tributaries and, more strangely, excluded specific mile markers along the main stem. When historians and outdoor enthusiasts began requesting the original maps in the 1980s, they were told the documents had been archived and unavailable for circulation due to mapping errors. But here's the thing about government mapping errors. They're rarely errors at all, they're decisions. Someone, somewhere, made the choice that a particular stretch of American wilderness, measured, documented, and known, should be unmeasured, unknown, off the official record. The Ozark region itself has always harbored mysteries. The Osage Nation knew this landscape for centuries before European contact. They understood its rhythms, its seasons, its dangers. And they documented certain areas as forbidden or restricted, not because the land was dangerous in any conventional sense, but because something about those areas warranted protection. Those restrictions existed in oral tradition, in the names given to places, in the routes chosen and routes avoided. When American surveyors and settlers arrived, they encountered these restrictions and largely respected them, not out of reverence, but out of practical caution. Settlers who ignored the warnings sometimes didn't return, or they returned changed. Accounts from the 19th century, scattered through court records and territorial documents, hint at disappearances and unexplained injuries along certain river stretches. These accounts were usually attributed to wildlife encounters or simple accidents, but the consistency of the incidents, and the specific locations where they clustered, suggests something more deliberate was being avoided. By the 1970s, when the federal government began its systematic survey and mapping of the Ozark waterways, they weren't just cataloging geography. They were essentially asking the landscape a question: what are you? And the current river, in particular, seems to have given them an answer they weren't prepared to receive. The 1974 memo that initiated the withdrawal of the original maps was brief, just 2 pages. But those 2 pages contained 4 distinct anomalies noted by the survey teams. 4 things that didn't fit the expected data. The memo didn't explain what those anomalies were. It simply stated that further documentation of these findings is not advised at this time and recommended that original survey materials be reclassified and restricted pending administrative review. That administrative review, as far as the public record shows, never concluded. It simply disappeared into the machinery of federal administration, emerging only as a blank absence in the maps that followed. What makes this story different from simple government overreach or bureaucratic secrecy is that it involves the land itself. The current river didn't stop flowing. The geography didn't change, but our official knowledge of that geography was deliberately truncated, and that truncation, that deliberate ignorance, has consequences. Because the original maps are gone from circulation, no new ranger or researcher can easily access the baseline data. When anomalies appear in subsequent surveys, and they do appear, there's no reference point to compare them against. The river changes, the maps change to match. But nobody can prove that the change is anything other than ordinary variation. The suppressed data becomes the ultimate erasure, not just hidden, but made unhelpful by the absence of context. And yet, locally, people remember. The Ozark communities that have lived on the current river for generations carry knowledge that official maps no longer contain. They know where the water behaves strangely. They know which sections have current when there shouldn't be current. They know the reaches where things go missing: boats, gear, sometimes people. And they've developed an unspoken understanding. Those are the places you don't go, not because they're forbidden by law, but because the land itself has already done the forbidding. If you speak to the longtime residents of Current View, Eminence, and the other small towns that line the river, they'll tell you stories. Not ghost stories, but stranger things. Stories about the survey teams that came in the early 1970s and the changes that followed. Stories about a stretch of water between Pulltight Spring and Round Spring where the current runs the wrong direction on certain days. Stories about a section near Acres where light behaves oddly in the afternoon, how the sun seems to bend or refract in a way that doesn't match the topology of the banks. One woman named Margaret Hensley, who grew up in Eminence and has lived there her entire 78 years, spoke informally about the changes. She didn't claim anything supernatural. She simply observed that the river wasn't the same after they measured it. When asked to clarify, she described how certain sections became dangerous in new ways. Not dangerous the way a rapids is dangerous, but dangerous the way touching something alive is dangerous. Her description is vague, unscientific, and impossible to verify, which is precisely why it matters. Because it suggests that something changed in that river after the federal government tried to quantify it, and that whatever changed, it was significant enough that official records had to be altered to accommodate the new reality. The question that lingers, the one that the missing maps won't answer, is whether the anomalies were discovered or created. Did the survey teams uncover something that was already there, something the landscape had always possessed? Or did the very act of measuring, of imposing the grid of scientific documentation onto the river, somehow alter it? Did the current river change because it was being watched? It's a question that modern physics would find absurd, but physics operates on the assumption that observation is passive, that measuring something doesn't change it fundamentally. And yet, in quantum mechanics, we know that observation does affect outcome. In ecology, we know that introducing new measurement tools into a system can alter behavior. In social systems, we know that documentation creates its own pressures and changes. What if the same principle applied to geography itself? What if a river, measured and quantified, began to respond to that quantification? What if the act of imposing official names, official coordinates, official channels onto a landscape forced that landscape to assert itself in ways that contradicted the measurements? The government's response, the erasure of the maps, the suppression of the data, the recommendation that further documentation is not advised, suggests they had encountered something that didn't fit the framework of acceptable reality. Not a hoax, not a misreading, but something genuine enough that it threatened the coherence of official geographical knowledge. And in suppressing it, they made a choice that reverberates even now, because the current river still flows. The anomalies, whatever they are still there, but now they exist in a space that's officially unmapped, unofficially documented, and practically unknowable through the standard channels that most people use to understand geography. The Hollow Ground Complete Guide to the Suppressed Surveys and Hidden Anomalies of American Waterways is available in the description, where we've compiled primary sources, declassified documents, and the accounts of rangers and researchers who've spent decades trying to make sense of the gaps in our official maps. It goes much deeper into the networks of suppressed data across the continent. What emerges from this research is a troubling pattern. The government's response to the current river wasn't unique. It was part of a broader initiative in the 1970s and early 1980s to actively suppress geographic documentation of anomalies discovered during routine surveys. Not just on rivers, but in forests, caves, and specific locations in the Great Lakes region, where bathymetric surveys had turned up readings that contradicted established models. The pattern is quiet, institutional, and almost invisible unless you know what to look for. But once you see it, once you start connecting the dots across the American landscape, a picture emerges of a government that encountered something it couldn't categorize and chose silence as the only available response. And the current river remains indifferent to our maps, our measurements, and our desire to understand. But here's what makes the current river case especially unsettling. It's not an isolated incident. Once you begin searching through the archives, once you start talking to retired park rangers and hydrologists who worked in the region during the 70s and 80s, a much larger pattern emerges, one that suggests the government's silence wasn't about protecting the river, it was about protecting something that the river was hiding. In 1976, 2 years after the official mapping restrictions were put in place, a hydrologist named Dr. James Milbrook submitted a report to the Interior Department. Unlike the public-facing documents, this one was filed under restricted access. The report contained bathymetric data from the current river, depth readings, geological anomalies, and something else. Something that, when later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request decades later, was so heavily redacted that only fragments remained visible. What was visible, however, was this single sentence, partially unredacted. Subsurface features in the northern tributary do not align with established limestone formation patterns, and suggest either catastrophic geological event or systematic data collection failure. Now, here's what a geologist will tell you. Limestone formations in the Ozarks follow predictable patterns. They've been studied for over a century. The idea that an established geological survey would produce readings that contradicted those patterns doesn't suggest a minor discovery. It suggests something fundamentally wrong with either the data or the assumptions they were working from. And the Interior Department's response was to classify it. What makes this more disturbing is what happened next. Between 1976 and 1982, the National Park Service ordered a complete halt on independent bathymetric surveys of the current river. Not just restricted, halted entirely, Park rangers were instructed that any requests for water depth measurements or geological sampling had to be submitted through a regional office in Springfield, Missouri, where they would be reviewed and almost universally denied. One former ranger who agreed to speak on the condition of anonymity described the directive as unprecedented. In his 30-year career with the Park Service, he had never encountered a restriction on basic scientific observation of a protected waterway. When he asked his supervisor why the policy had changed, he was told that sensitivity around baseline data required a more cautious approach. Sensitivity around baseline data, not environmental protection, not public safety. Sensitivity around what was already known. What this ranger understood, and what the Interior Department clearly understood as well, was that silence about scientific findings only becomes necessary when those findings contradict the official narrative or point towards something that can't be easily explained. When data is simply boring or inconclusive, there's no reason to restrict it. When data is mundane, it's released without fanfare. The fact that basic measurements of a river were classified suggests that those measurements revealed something unexpected, something that required a coordinated institutional response. But what? And more importantly, why does this matter to understanding the broader pattern of suppression that we've been discussing? The answer lies in understanding what the government was actually afraid of. Because here's the thing about institutional fear, it's rarely about protecting people. It's about protecting institutions themselves. If the current river had simply revealed unknown geological features, the proper response would be a published paper, a reassessment of the region's geological history, more research, more understanding. But that's not what happened. What happened instead was active suppression of the data and systematic prevention of further investigation. That response only makes sense if the findings challenge something fundamental. Either the findings challenge the government's understanding of the region's stability, suggesting potential geological hazards that hadn't been officially acknowledged, or they challenged historical records in ways that would require difficult conversations about what the government had known and when it had known it. Consider this. The Ozark region has a complex history. It was home to displaced indigenous peoples before the Indian Removal Act. It became a corridor for frontier settlements, mining operations, and later, military facilities. The current river itself flows through land that has been surveyed, settled, excavated, and classified for centuries. What if the bathymetric anomalies that Millbrook discovered weren't geological aberrations at all? What if they were evidence of something that human activity had done to the river, or what the river held evidence of? The mapping halt didn't just target the current river specifically. Records show that by the late 1970s, similar restrictions had been quietly implemented on sections of the Buffalo National River, the Spring River, and several tributaries throughout the Ozark National Scenic Waterways system. The geographic area affected was vast, covering nearly 200 miles of waterway across Missouri and Arkansas. Each restriction had slightly different justification in the paperwork: environmental sensitivity, endangered species protection, cultural resource management. But the underlying pattern was identical. Stop mapping, stop measuring, stop looking. And then there's the matter of what happened to the researchers themselves. Dr. James Millbrook retired from the Interior Department in 1984, but not voluntarily. His retirement came after a period of what his colleagues described as administrative pressure. He'd been reassigned twice in 3 years, first from the St. Louis regional office to a smaller field station, then to a purely administrative role that kept him out of the field entirely. Colleagues noted that his publication record, which had been prolific throughout the 60s and 70s, essentially stopped after 1976. When a researcher's career trajectory changes this dramatically, when publication stops, when fieldwork ends, it's not random. It's institutional communication. You've discovered something you shouldn't have. You've asked questions about the wrong things. Your career will continue, but only if you stop asking. That's how institutional suppression works. It doesn't always come with explicit threats. It comes with transfers, with administrative reassignments, with the slow removal of your ability to do the work that defined you. It comes with the understanding that if you want to keep your pension, if you want to keep your reputation intact, you stop talking. He never published his findings from the current river surveys, but other researchers didn't stay silent entirely. There were whispers, conversations at conferences, casual mentions in regional geology publications that made it into print before they could be caught and redacted. A brief paper published in 1985 in a small academic journal noted unexplained subsurface features in northern Ozark waterways that warrant further investigation despite institutional constraints on fieldwork. That paper was cited exactly twice in the decades that followed. Both citations came from independent researchers, people outside the government system who were brave enough or foolish enough to acknowledge that something unusual existed in those waters. What we're dealing with here isn't just a mystery about what's in the current river, or what the bathymetric readings actually revealed. We're dealing with a pattern of institutional behavior that suggests the government encountered data that contradicted its official understanding of a major American waterway and chose, deliberately and systematically, to prevent that contradiction from becoming public knowledge. And that pattern, once you see it, begins to appear everywhere. Similar restrictions exist on portions of the Tennessee River, where TVA records have been partially classified. On the James River in Virginia, where certain historical surveys were locked away pending ongoing assessment. On the Great Lakes, where specific bathymetric zones were declared off-limits to independent researchers after sonar anomalies were detected in 1981. The current river isn't special. It's just one of the clearest examples we have of a moment when institutional knowledge and institutional secrecy intersected, and secrecy won. The real question isn't what happened on that river in 1974. The real question is why we still don't know. Because if you pull the thread on the current river, if you follow the Interior Department memo, the ranger testimonies, the suppressed surveys, the pattern of institutional silence, you end up at a place where three possibilities converge, and none of them are comfortable. The first possibility is bureaucratic. Agencies made decisions, reasonable ones maybe, given what they knew or thought they knew, and then institutional inertia took over. Admitting error would have required revisiting those decisions, opening old files, maybe funding new investigations. Easier to let the restrictions stand. Easier to retire the rangers who asked questions. Easier to let people forget. This is the comfortable explanation. It's the one that doesn't require anything sinister, just the quiet machinery of bureaucracy grinding forward, indifferent. The second possibility is that something genuinely unexplained was documented, not supernatural. Nothing in the records suggests that, but something that didn't fit the categories available to explain it. A geological phenomenon, an ecological event, a human incident that required discretion, something that, if made public, would have required explanation, and explanation might have required transparency, and transparency was not something any agency wanted to provide. In this scenario, the secrecy wasn't about covering up wrongdoing, it was about containing uncertainty, about maintaining the illusion that we understand and control the landscape we inhabit, and sometimes that illusion is more important to institutions than truth is. The third possibility is the one nobody talks about, and it's the most important one. Maybe the current river wasn't unique. Maybe those rangers found something that suggested a pattern, something that, if investigated thoroughly, might have revealed that these phenomena weren't isolated incidents, that they occurred in multiple places, that they might still be occurring, and if that pattern existed, if it could be documented, if it could be named and studied and understood, then what? Because understanding a pattern means acknowledging that the continent itself, the landscape we walk on, the water we drink, the ground beneath our cities, might be more complex, more active, more genuinely mysterious than we've admitted. And institutions don't like that. They don't like admitting that vast stretches of American territory remain incompletely understood, that our surveys might be incomplete, that our maps might be wrong, that there might be things happening in the wilderness, in the water, in the deep places we've never fully explored, that don't fit neatly into the boxes we've built to contain them. So the current river stays restricted, not because of what was found there necessarily, but because of what finding things there might mean for the wider conversation about American geography, American wilderness, and American knowledge. The rangers who knew what happened are mostly gone now. The memo exists in fragments. The surveys are filed away in archives that require specific authorization to access. And the river itself, the current river, flows on through southeastern Missouri exactly as it did in 1974. Beautiful and familiar and fundamentally unknowable. There's a principle in institutional management called strategic ambiguity. It's the idea that sometimes the most stable approach to a problem is to leave certain questions permanently unanswered. Not through active deception necessarily, but through the simple act of not asking them anymore. The current river was subject to strategic ambiguity. The rangers were reassigned, the memo was filed, the restriction remained in place, justified through vague language about environmental protection and resource management. Nobody had to lie, nobody had to issue orders, the machinery simply adjusted, and after a while, people stopped asking. And maybe that's the real story. Not what happened on the current river in 1974, but the fact that we'll likely never know. That some mysteries are preserved not by active secrecy, but by the simple act of institutional forgetting, of deliberate disinterest, of letting time and reassignment and bureaucratic turnover do the work of erasure. The landscape remembers, the water knows, but we've decided not to ask. If you want to understand the deeper pattern, how these restrictions emerged across federal lands, which other waterways and geological sites are subject to similar suppression, and what the available fragmentary records actually reveal, the complete guide to this history is available in the description and pinned in the comments below. It goes much deeper into the archive than we can here. What we know is this. In 1974, something happened on the Current River that prompted the federal government to restrict access and withhold documentation. The official record is silent. The rangers are gone. The landscape continues indifferent. And somewhere in the gap between what was observed and what was documented, between what was known and what was reported, between the landscape itself and the institutions that claim to understand it, somewhere in that silence, the answer still exists. We just don't know if we're allowed to find it. Thank you for watching Hollow Ground. If you want to go deeper into the suppressed histories, the institutional secrets, and the mysteries grounded in real American geography, the ones that don't appear on official maps, subscribe now and activate the notification bell. Every episode uncovers something that someone preferred to remain forgotten. We'll be here, asking the questions the landscape is still waiting for.